Now alive.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get things kicked off. Since we are at time, I want to make sure we stay on schedule. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day two of the Powering Inclusion Summit put on by the Center for Economic Inclusion. My name is Sam Ndely. I am the Director of Employer Inclusivity here at the Center for Economic Inclusion, and I am going to be moderating today's Activator Lab featuring Ty and Jeff, and we are going to talk about big ideas for small business. And I'm very excited to have both of these lovely people on our panel today. The work that they're doing is very, very important and insightful, and it's going to help push our country and region forward when it comes to small businesses, specifically Black businesses, and how we look at wealth creation and things like that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and allow Jeff and Ty to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about who they are and the work that they do. And then we're going to go right into the conversation. And we have some questions that we have had preset, and we're going to allow for some opportunity for some Q&A. So let's start with Ty. If you can go ahead and just tell the people who you are, where you're from, and a little bit about what you do.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here with you and appreciate you taking the time to join the Activator Lab. I'm Tynesia Boyea-Robinson, but you can call me Ty. I'm the CEO of CapEQ, which stands for Capitalism and Emotional Intelligence and Equity. And I currently live in Dallas, Texas, but you said where I was from. I was born in California and grew up in Florida. And at CapEQ, we work with government, we work with companies, and we work with philanthropy to change how the world does business. We're an impact investing and advisory firm, and we work to make sure that capital lands in ways that actually drive social impact. And by capital, it's all forms: intellectual, financial, human, all of the pieces that help drive a thriving economy. So thanks for having us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then Jeff, you want to go ahead and share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Aguy. I'm originally from Haiti, but like Ty, also grew up in Florida. I currently reside in Minneapolis. I'm the managing director of a company called 2043, and I'm a partner at a company called Next. The work that I do is at the intersection of entrepreneurship and economic development. After the last 10 years of experience in entrepreneurship and economic development, one of the things that I realized very early was that we don't have enough, we have too many silos, not enough groups talking to one another, and the short-term nature of trying to solve our problems that have been around for generations, just it doesn't work. And so with 2043, we take a long-term approach. It's a public-private philanthropic partnership approach. So we work with the institutions that have the power in order to make the change, to create an environment that makes it easier for entrepreneurs to build and scale their companies.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Jeff. And so the first question that I actually have today is going to be for Ty. And Ty, if you can talk a little bit about, I know you've been working on a plan that addresses wealth creation and for Black businesses and small businesses called 1555 plan. Can you talk a little bit about that and share some key takeaways that you would like everybody to know about that plan?
Sure. So I have a couple of slides for this part, and I promise it won't be death by slide. So I've been working on something called Path to 1555. And so if you look at the next slide, the 1555 comes from this stunning stat that if 15% of Black-owned businesses could hire at least one more employee, the American economy could grow by $55 billion and add 600,000 jobs. Now, that is actually the floor, not the ceiling. We have some new research coming out with Brookings that says it's probably even 2 to 3 times that amount. And so this is a collaborative effort actually working to get to that goal, to the 1555 in service of Black businesses to close racial wealth gaps. And if you look at the next slide, what we do and how we do that is we're a network of networks. So it's really about making sure that you are just kind of like what Jeff was saying, connecting the dots from all of these siloed efforts across the country in order to get to this bold goal. And in doing that, we want to remove the systemic barriers that people are experiencing nationally and aggregate and distribute capital in service of accelerating change. And so when you think about what the key takeaways are, I always like to show this next slide, which is around the key performance indicators. What makes 1555 different than a lot of other efforts is that it's focused on existing businesses. And when you think about wealth creation and job growth and entrepreneurship, people often like to think about like kind of the tech sexy startup space. But there are over 3 million employer businesses, Black businesses in the country right now, and lots of them don't have access to resources. So first, it's focusing on existing businesses. The second is actually making sure that you're investing in the interconnected systems. When you think about the silos, you have people over here doing policy work, you have people over there doing capital, you have people over there doing capacity building, but these groups unfortunately don't often talk together, they don't work together, they don't interconnect their efforts. And so we have all sorts of outcomes and performance indicators around the policy, the leadership, and other things that help enable an environment where Black businesses can thrive. And the last is about reimagining the possibilities. And this is actually, I think, the most powerful. It's really about what happens when you look at Black businesses as a source of innovation and opportunity, and not a deficit or something that's small that only happens in a mom and pop way. I often say that Uber or Lyft could have been started by Black people if we had access to capital, because we innovated gypsy cabs a really long time ago. And Uber and Lyft is just gypsy cabs with a technology platform. And the difference between who gets technology platforms and who doesn't is who gets capital and who doesn't. So those are just a few thoughts about 1555.
That's great, and thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that we talk about, especially the work we do at the center, is focusing on how do we address some of the policies that have prevented and have excluded people of color, specifically Black people in this country, from advancing in this economy, and especially in this region. And we look at some of the access to capital with redlining in banks and things like that, and the lack of investment of Black founders, and specifically Black women being 0.6% of investments from VCs. The innovation is, we know the innovation is within us. We lead in a lot of innovation, but when it comes to opportunity and access, we're at the bottom as well too. So that needs to change in order for us to really see the opportunity to grow and thrive. So Jeff, if you can talk a little bit about what 2043 is all about. I know that that's the year that you have on your calendar circled, and I know we've had conversations about it, and you have some things moving in that within your organization that you started. So if you can talk about, why did you choose 2043? What is it about that year specifically that you feel is going to be such a crucial year for this work?
Thanks so much, Sam. So 2043, we named our company a year because we radically believe that we can solve our most pressing economic inequality, economic inequality issues in a generation. We believe that by taking steps each year, in about 20 years, we can achieve that goal. A couple of things that we think is important when thinking about that is economic inequality is unsustainable. The rate of economic inequality, when you think about since 1965, the S&P 500 has grown by 4,118%. It's grown by 4,118%, most of that coming after 1990. So you're looking at a market-driven economy where the markets continue to do well and continue to exceed expectations while wages remain stagnant. And there's this wealth inequality that is so unsustainable that our society will just collapse if it continues to go. So businesses and corporations are smart, and they're going to recognize that there's going to have to be some changes that are made. And so that's one thing that's coming up. The other thing that's coming up is the country's getting more brown. By 2040, Black and brown people will become the majority of the country. And so we recognize that the country's getting more brown. Also, inequity persists amongst those communities, Black and brown communities, and it's not because of their fault. It's just a systemic as part of that. So for us, we realize the best way to bridge that gap, especially in the interim, is through entrepreneurship. Oftentimes we talk about how Black women don't receive capital, and that's true. When it comes to venture capital, you've already said 0.6%. But a couple of stats that we don't think about is that when it comes to companies that are making 100,000 in annual receipts, Black people actually outperform every other race. And there's no significant difference between Black and brown people. You only get that a significant difference when it comes to companies that are making $1 million in annual reoccurring revenue. So some folks have thought to solve that problem by focusing on the entrepreneur themselves, which I think is important. So if you think of it like a seed, you have all these accelerators that are trying to find the right seed or fix their company and different methodologies. Investors are trying to invest into the right seed. What we believe is it's more important to focus on the soil. And so we work with institutional partners who have the power to create the environment where entrepreneurs can grow and scale their businesses. Black folk don't have an issue with growing their with starting businesses. We actually start businesses really quickly. In fact, Black women start businesses at a faster rate than any other category, any other race. The issue becomes when it comes time to scale, because those scalability issues are more about relationships than it is about anything else. And those are the relationships that were oftentimes shut out. So we believe that by 2043, we can make a significant impact on the future economy, especially when you consider Kaufman's research that 100% of the net new jobs are started by entrepreneurs. 100% of the net new jobs are entrepreneurial. So when you think about that, if we continue to grow entrepreneurship in a significant way, then by 2043, I think we can make a significant change in economic inequality, specifically and especially for Black people.
Wow, thank you so much for breaking that down. Can you talk a little bit about more specifically, and this is another question back to Jeff, and then we're going to go back to Ty. Can you talk about locally, right? So what are some ways that 2043 as an organization is working locally to impact Black businesses here in this region?
So locally, one of the first things that we realized, we have really great organization like the Center, for example. Sam used to work at Meta, but locally what we realize is there's not enough data and insights to make smart and effective decisions. So one of our first initiatives over these next 3 years is mapping out the entrepreneurial ecosystem, both at the city level when it comes to St. Paul and at the state level. So that's understanding how companies are starting, what companies are getting funded, why are they getting funded, how are they getting funded. So that's that first and very important piece, is that data portion. One of the things that we did was launch this partnership with Hack the Gap called Entrepreneurs Access during COVID, where we did surveys and figuring out how are entrepreneurs faring and how are Black entrepreneurs faring. And we've used that data actually to work with foundations like the Knight Foundation, to consult with Launch Minnesota and other places to help them figure out how best they can provide resources for entrepreneurs and the kinds of resources that entrepreneurs need. And, this pandemic has affected Black entrepreneurs the most. And so that's an example of how this year specifically, we've helped with that. But in the future, it's also helping with policy decisions. I have a social justice background, but I recognize that social justice was a great way to raise awareness, but it wasn't necessarily the best mechanism for change. And so we're focused on the institutions who want to make change, but they don't necessarily know how. So we're providing them with data and insights, as well as bringing them together so that we can move forward in solutions that all of us agree on.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So Ty, if you can talk about some 2 game-changing opportunities that you see for closing the racial wealth gap. I know that you're based in Dallas, and I know the ecosystem there is a lot different than the Twin Cities, but if you want to talk about some of the wealth gap disparities that may be prevalent in Dallas between Black entrepreneurs and white entrepreneurs. I know there's different types of money down there there in Dallas, but if you can talk about some opportunities for closing that wealth gap, that'll be great.
Sure. I mean, Dallas is pretty comparable to many other communities in terms of the racial wealth gap. And I would say Dallas in particular has less infrastructure than you would think than some cities. It doesn't have a CDFI. There isn't actually a really strong local Black-owned bank. So there's some kind of basics that are missing here, but Path to 1555 is a national effort. And I'd kind of like to step back and talk nationally about what we're seeing. One of the things that we've noticed is people, about a couple of years ago after that Road to Zero Wealth report came out, everyone was in the streets talking about closing the racial wealth gaps, closing the racial wealth gaps. And you saw a lot around housing, you saw a lot around education, but there's close to $100 billion of philanthropic dollars that's given every year. And a tiny, tiny fraction goes to businesses, Black business growth. And the reason why that is challenging is because it represents 1 in 5 Black people are actually hired by Black business owners. Also, Black business owners are 12 times wealthier than their non-business owner peers. So if you really want to be serious about closing the racial wealth gaps, you have to use that philanthropic capital that can be a catalyst for change and service of business investment and growth. And I think one of the biggest barriers to that is mindset. Philanthropy is often set up in a way where it's about charity as opposed to fueling economic revolutions.
Yeah.
And so one huge idea is around philanthropic capital that close to $100 billion. It's already being thrown out the door right now on things that are supposed to help people and save people, to actually be about capital that's investing in huge growth. And so over the last couple of months, Path to 1555 actually has pledges from multiple foundations across the country of over $100 million to actually start to channel more of that money towards Black business growth. Another thing that we've heard from Path to 1555 is even when entrepreneurs get access to capital, Black businesses get access to capital, it's not usable. And what do I mean by usable? We often use this analogy that if you had an airplane and it had bags of money, bags on bags of money, but you had no airstrip, it wouldn't matter that the money was there because it would never get in the hands of the people that need it. And that's kind of how capital is set up right now. You have a lot of organizations now saying that they're putting capital aside in service of Black business growth. But what happens when you kind of look behind the scenes on what does it take to access that money? If it takes a huge balance sheet, you know what? That's going to exclude a lot of Black people because of things like redlining. Our assets aren't in the same place.
Yep.
Credit scores often keep us from having access to money. There's a long list of things. If you look at the underwriting policies that allow people to get access to capital, that's why capital usually doesn't land in ways that can drive Black business growth. So the second big idea that we've been working on with Path to 1555 over the last couple of months is this effort called Underwriting for Racial Equity. And it's a cohort of financial institutions across the country who are working together to change their underwriting practices. And that's everybody from typical financial institutions like lending to VC firms and figuring out what does it look like to be first leader capital. And we realized from research that a lot of the reasons that money doesn't land, when you look past all of the policies and practices, it really boils down to, do I believe this person is a good investment? And the issue with that is that bias often says Black people are not. And we know that we are. We know for a fact that we are. And so that's why we have to have the policies and practices in place that actually help drive that change, because we are the assets that this country needs to grow and thrive in a 21st century global economy.
Right. That's such a, you brought up, first off, thank you. That was amazing. You brought up a lot of really great points. Number one thing I'll say in response to what you just said, as far as Black people being the assets, yes, we are the assets that built this country from the very beginning. So we talk about when you go to a bank and they talk about how we don't have any assets or anything to put up as collateral. We understand that it was set up for us not to be able to have those things in place. And I think that I would love to have a conversation offline about your underwriting platform, because I think that is crucial. My experience working at a CDFI and working with banks, I know that there is that challenge for banks to be able to look at how do they lend money out to specifically Black-owned businesses, and what are some of the things that they're looking for to be able to qualify for a loan and to be considered bankable. And I think that nothing's going to change unless the policies change, the underwriting policies and practices change. So that's great. I think that's going to be huge. So I wanted to pose a question that's open to both of you next. And as we wrap this part of the segment, I hope that our audience is enjoying the conversation thus far and thinking of some questions to ask in the Q&A portion. So just continue to jot things down and get ready to ask away. But this question is for both of you all. So when we talked a little bit about tech, and we know that the tech industry is a popular growing industry for specifically Black entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs of color. They're making some concerted efforts to be able to fund more Black businesses in the tech industry. But what are some other industries that you see Black entrepreneurs have an opportunity to focus on that could help make some sustainable generational impact to help bridge that wealth gap?
So I can jump in. If you look at the data, and we'll just I know there's a difference between revenue and profitability, but let's start with the high earning revenue industries. If you look at just employer firms, so not non-employer firms, but businesses that actually have employees, the top 3 industries actually for highest revenue are wholesale trade, manufacturing, and utilities. That is not sexy. That does not sound like, oh, I woke up this morning and I was going to do utilities. But listen to this. And utilities is a $5.6 trillion revenue, right? Of that, Black business owners only have 85 million. That's insane. That is like, just think about that disparity. There's this industry here where multiple business owners across the country are making money off of. And the reason why Black business owners are only making 85 million in revenue is because they're across the country. There are a total of 18, less than 20, 18 Black businesses in utilities.
Wow.
What that tells me is some of these really basic bread and butter stuff that people know how to do. It's not like curing cancer. It's not creating the new gizmo. It's like the basic bread and butter where we know is high revenue. We actually need the capital investment to be able to even play in some of those fields. And we're underrepresented in some of that. So I know it might not be as cool, but like, let's actually use the basics and the foundations. If these are high revenue businesses, what does it take to actually get more Black people in those businesses to earn those revenue? Because that is what actually drives the employee growth as well. So that's kind of like the bread and butter type of industries. But if you also kind of step back and you think about, well, where are we represented? If you look at the research, Black businesses are often over-indexed in low earning revenue businesses because of bias and access to capital. Well, why don't we start with that? And you say, okay, if that's what it is, why don't we look at that as a strength? Why don't we say, hey, where are we over indexed? That means we have more of an access to this market and we might be able to have more opportunities. There's actually over a third of Black businesses are in healthcare and health taking industries. And over half of those business owners are women. So when you think about this concept of shifting the narrative and reimagining the narrative, there's this new tech company called Care Academy, and it's actually around reinvesting in the workforce of the healthcare worker because there's so many Black women in those fields, and using that to upskill them, to train them, to give them a path of career pipeline, to create that and professionalize that industry so it can demand higher revenue. So it's kind of like those old school both and things that help outside of tech, that if we can get much more strategic about investing and targeting in, we actually don't have to worry about, well, does this industry work or are we already there? It's really about making sure that we command the revenue that we deserve for the strength that we already have.
Definitely.
Beautiful.
Go ahead, Jeff. I would love to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
I think Ty gave some really compelling answers and points. One of the things that I think we have to look at is the fundamental structure of our economy. We have a market-driven economy where it favors tech businesses because it's market-driven. When you think about tech being sexy or tech being what's investable and tech being what investors can get their quickest exit out of, those are the reasons why tech is popular. It's not necessarily because it's the most usable or folks are hiring the most employees and all that. So we have to first start there. One of the things that I think we really have to think about is coming from a strength-based perspective. Like, what do we do really well? One of the books that after, going to grad school and, reading all these economics books and doing a lot of research on innovation, the book that's the most compelling to me has been Carter G. Woodson's book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And in that book, he really gives an analogy about a daughter of a woman who used to wash clothes, right? And she goes to school to like do accounting or something like that and tries to get into these industries that they don't even let her in because of racism, because she doesn't want to have anything to do with washing clothes or any of those things. But then he uses the example of a laundromat and how much money laundromats generate every year. So I'm using that example to say, when you think about areas that we do really well, like for example, retail, $5.4 trillion in annual revenue. When you think about food and beverage, $765 billion in annual revenue. That was just in 2019. So I think those are some industries that we can really get into. And I think what we need help and focus on is scaling. It's not necessarily the industry, but how can we scale? How can we provide those relationships? McKinsey came out with a report just last year, last October, I believe, last November, that over the next 8 years, we could increase our GDP by $1.5 trillion just by getting rid of racism. Like, we're costing the economy $1.5 trillion just because we're racist. Another study that they did, right, is that companies that are racially diverse at their executive levels perform 43% better from a profit margin standpoint. So the data is very clear. Diversity, equity, and inclusion in entrepreneurship or in the business sectors actually have a higher chance for folks to have a higher profit margin. It's good for the country in general. It's good for our economy. And so the only reason why it's not happening, it's because of racism. And oftentimes we like to focus on the historical nature of redlining and not having those kinds of assets in order to get a bank loan and all those things, which is really understandable. But the facts are that even for Black folks who have wealth, it's still difficult for them to get the kinds of loans that they need. Even for the Black folks who have the bright idea and the bright businesses, or who come from, I had a friend who had 10 years in the food business at the highest level, 10 years, and he couldn't get a loan to start his business. And he has one of the most thriving businesses now without a loan. They basically said, hey, you're not worthy of a loan, even though he had all the box checked that we're talking about. And so I think it's important to recognize that even when we do have those box checked, there's still that racism thing that's hovering over us. And that's why I think it's so important to work with institutions that understand that, especially with philanthropy, institutions who have within their mission to solve some of those problems and leverage that capital, because it's risk capital. It's capital that you're not necessarily expecting this high return. However, you will get that return. And so I think that's the focus on the capital that's easily accessible and capital that we can get out the door and get more people on that side of things.
Yeah, I think in regards to even the comment you made about your friend who wasn't able, and I know who the friend is. I know exactly who you're talking about. I think going back to a point that Ty mentioned, it's all about those underwriting policies and practices, right? A lot of people don't even realize how racist they are because that's just what the policy is. And they don't realize the policy was created in the root of racism and to exclude people from having opportunity and access to the capital that grew the middle class and grew the economy. So it's definitely goes back to, all that goes back to policies. Policies were created to help advance or prevent people from moving in this society, right? You have policies that prevented people from voting. You have policies that prevented people from getting a loan. You have policies that prevented people from running for office and things like that, right? So we have to look at policy and really work hand in hand. And from the business side of things, entrepreneurs, especially Black entrepreneurs, need to be educated about what are these policies and where do they come from and how do they affect you? Because if you're not able to advocate on your own behalf, then you're going to continue to run in circles around trying to grow your business, but not truly being able to reach the full potential of where you can go because the system won't allow you to do it. There may be some unicorns in the mix, right? Who'll be able to break through and to really grow and thrive. But this is about how do we push our entire nation when it comes to Black people forward to be able to achieve those different opportunities and really build that wealth for families for generations to come. One other thing I would like to ask real quick for both of y'all, is there anything else that you would like to share about this topic or any additional work that you're doing in regards to wealth building or Black entrepreneurship? So I'll have Ty go.
I was waiting for Jeff because I took the question first.
Oh,
I was
no, I
trying
didn't
to
want to,
use
sometimes as men, we like to try to interrupt Black women. So I was make sure that I was.
all right. I'll take that.
Go,
I'll take that. So another issue that we're working on with Path to 1555, folks might know of the Executive Leadership Council. It is close to 1,000 of the most senior Black professionals in Fortune 1000 companies. And one thing we're working on with them is procurement. So I just talked about underwriting for racial equity. And one of the things with procurement, which you'll often see, is that large companies and financial institutions create a policy death trap for businesses to be able to actually get access to opportunity. And what I mean by that, a large company will say, oh, well, yes, you have to go through these 15 hoops to even be able to be vetted to work for my company. And then sooner or later, their order is so big. I know you see this a lot in Target with Minneapolis. Their order is so big, they actually don't have the money to actually be able to order all the products that they need, for instance, to be able to service that contract. So then they have to go get a loan from the bank or something. And the bank says, well, actually, no, they hit the underwriting criteria. So even if they can get access to opportunity, they can't get the bank loan, or they can't even get through the hoops because corporate put so many different hoops in the way that actually require you to be a larger firm. And so it's just this vicious cycle. So we're working with ELC now on a procurement cohort on how to get their companies to work on their procurement practices as well. And the interesting thing, as you'll see, our path to 1555 is really about taking this systemic challenge and taking kind of inflection points from manageable chunks that have huge impact, but that you can pull people around the table and do something with. Like, it might not sound like truly innovative to do underwriting for racial justice if you don't understand underwriting. But when you get behind the scenes and realize that if underwriting shifts in a major way, that releases capital. It's, you can think of capital as being kind of constipated. It kind of releases the capital across the country. Similarly with procurement, if you can get companies to change their policies on how they're screening for folks or their responsibility and intersection with the financial institution, now that releases opportunity for more people. So we're constantly looking for those really high impact but targeted wins in order to drive systems change across the country.
Wonderful. I think one of the last things you said reminds me of a book. Have you read the book The Color of Law before? Yes, that's a book that I would highly suggest that you read. It talks about redlining. It talks about underwriting and how the banking institution has created these racial disparities within our country. So it's called The Color of Law. Jeff, how about you? It's your turn.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sam. I think in the Twin Cities, it's important to acknowledge the organizations that have been doing a lot of that work, especially with the center. Really, Tawana is someone who I really look up to as a leader in this community and how she's been able to work with so many large corporations in order to start solving some of the problems for us. One of the things that we're working on, in 1990, the US government, along with other world organizations, launched this project called the Human Genome Project. And from 1990 to 2003, what they were able to do was map the human genome. And mapping the human genome really helped them to understand at what specific DNA levels do we get sickness or particular cancers in other areas. So we're able to create drugs and other things to target specific people based off of your genetic makeup. For us at 2043, what we're working on is doing the same thing for entrepreneurial ecosystems, is really understanding the DNA of entrepreneurial ecosystems, specifically entrepreneurial ecosystems where Black folks represent a large portion of it or have the potential to represent a large portion. So that's what we're really focused on. And that's beyond just getting data from Crunchbase. There's this company there that does some kind of genome mapping, but really all they're doing is they're getting data from Crunchbase, punching it into a system, and then you're getting some data visualizations and saying, hey, that's the genome for the cities, which I think is ineffective. So we want to really get to the detailed level, as we talked about continuing to grow our partnerships with philanthropic partners, with city and state partners, as well as with large corporations. For example, Ty gave the example of Target. Target is one of those companies that I think have done a pretty good job of trying to incorporate more Black businesses. But one of the challenges, a lot of our Black businesses are not ready for scale for a Target. And like you were saying, the challenges that they face. So how can we create different pathways, recognizing for Black entrepreneurs, because of the systemic history that have existed, we can't expect to go through the same pathways and have a high level of success. That's like telling our folks to continue to make bricks without straw, if you know that kind of analogy from back in the day. But really, it's saying that we need new pathways in order to scale our companies. We're really good at starting businesses. We are outperforming our counterparts in terms of $100,000 in annual receipts. So it's not a matter of starting business, it's a matter of scaling. And we need to continue to tell our entrepreneurs, it's not that they're not doing the right thing or they don't know what they're doing. It's the fact that we need to create more opportunities to actually help them scale and create more pathways. So this project Genome will help us to really understand ecosystems in a lot more intimate way and map those out, and then provide insights to institutional partners and how they can actually meet those needs.
Great. So we're going to be transitioning shortly into the Q&A section. Before then, we still have a lot of time left together. So I'm going to ask, I actually came up with a couple more questions that I wanted to ask based off of the conversation that we had, which was a great conversation. So thank you both so much for everything you shared and the work that you're doing in your respective areas. I think there's a lot of synergy that both of you have. So hopefully after this, you guys will find some ways to work with each other and work with the Center for Economic Inclusion on a continuing basis. But I guess for one question I have to ask in response to something Jeff just mentioned, when we're looking at the business starts that Black businesses have, how, during my time working at MEDA as a business consultant, and for those who don't know, MEDA is the Metropolitan Economic Development Association. It's a CDFI locally here in the Twin Cities, and we work with minority entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we saw a lot when I was there is the industries that we had a lot of Black businesses starting were a lot in the food and beverage, and in the services and the hospitality industry, right? And then also we had some in the medical when it comes to like home healthcare businesses getting started. Let's talk about innovation. What are some ways that we can innovate in those areas, especially considering the fact that when you look at food and bev, COVID has really hit that industry hard, and that's a majority of those Black businesses that we serve at that organization. So what are some ways, in your opinions, that we could innovate in that area as Black people to survive, number one, but then and what are some ways that you've seen people do that thus far?
Wow. Intellectual property. I think it's important to infuse technology in what we do and have intellectual property. So I'll be very frank about what I'm about to say. If you look at, and I sometimes feel like, should I be this open? But I just think that we're at a point where respectable politics doesn't work as much. If you look at a lot of the things that have happened in America, so what happens often is, even from the 1800s, is Black people are doing something. People look at it and say, oh, this is what they're doing. They recreate what they did and then patent it, because they know how to do that, right? And that's what we saw happen over time. Even with like, there's a new movement now talking about repackaging food. You know, the kind of thing that we had for soul food, now it's Southern food. Like there's all these things that happen. And so what we could do, I think, is own our own intellectual property and use technology better. So my friend who I was telling you about, who were really close friends, he has a restaurant. In fact, he was able to open a second restaurant during COVID. And one of the things that made his restaurant successful is the back end of it, the technology that he was using. So prior to COVID, he already had the tech infrastructure and platform for people to drive up and come and get food. He just hadn't released it yet, but he already had it. So when COVID struck, it was very easy for him to quickly pivot to, hey, you can order your food through his website, through his platform. You come and pick up your food through his platform. He's not sharing those funds with a second party. His point of sales was already integrated with that system, right? And so his restaurant has been able to thrive to the point where they've been able to open a second restaurant at a time where people are closing. And so I think the key areas that we can really work on is technology integration, and then figuring out a way to, whether it's patents or finding a way to capitalize on our intellectual property, because that's where a lot of investors value. They value your intellectual property, and I think anyone can come up with this. For another example, in retail, we think about a lot of people starting hoodies, right? Hoodies or t-shirts. That's really great. But when you're working with Target, they want to know, how are you sourcing that? Or do you have the capacity to bring that in a large sale? And if all you're doing is going online and putting the name on the shirt and printing it, it makes it very difficult for you to work with a company like that. So really working on the back end stuff. Yes, the marketing is going really well now, and folks are doing a lot better at marketing their products, but really making sure that our back end can handle being plugged into an organization that can help scale. And in that way, we're not continuing, like the example Ty gave earlier, like someone could have started Uber way before if they had the technology backend, right? And so I think the work that Ty is doing to bring in more capital to Black entrepreneurs will actually help with that. And I look forward, I think this will be the golden age of innovation for Black companies. I really believe that over the next 5 to 10 years.
Wonderful. Ty, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Jeff captured a lot of it. So if I had my druthers, and I don't have them yet, I would actually create some hackathons around hack the Black industry, right? So if you look at over a third of business dimensions are in healthcare, what are the needs of those businesses, right? If you think about us being over-indexed in lower revenue businesses, that means our markets are fragmented. That means that there aren't economies of scale. That means there's opportunity, but people don't look at our businesses as opportunity. So what would it look like to kind of think about what do all the mom and pop shops need across the country that are run by Black businesses? And come up with the firm or the company that meets those needs. A great example of that is a company called Maven. A good friend of mine, Keisha Cash, Impact America Fund, actually invested in that company, and they're doing amazing. They aggregate demand for Black hairdressers, and they do that with weaves. We Black. I'm going to talk about it. They do that for weaves. Weaves are higher income, right? Like they are higher revenue product for Black hairdressers. So by aggregating the demand, by handling all their marketing, they actually put more money in the pockets now of those Black hairdressers because weaves are higher margin. Mm-hmm. But when they went, before Impact America Fund was out there, and they were trying to talk to the normal VC people about why weaves would be a profit margin, a high profit margin business, people were like, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. And they're doing great. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is like our own mindset. We have to stop looking at our entrepreneurial spirit and our ingenuity as like a hustle or something on the side. Actually, it is our innovation. It is our genius. And when you look at ourselves like that, then you can start to see opportunity. And so if we're doing things over here like amassing capital to be focused on more Black businesses, and if we're doing things over here like having racial underwriting for equity, then we need ourselves to start looking at ourselves as the assets we are to come up with those innovations and hold that capital accountable. If we say we're going to bring you capital, you bring the ideas. Yes. You bring the change. You know what I mean? And I saw Tawana chatted, and it has been too long, Tawana. I love you so much. Yes, I saw you. I'd give you a big hug.
I love that point, Ty. I think that's major. And first thing I'll say is Keisha Cash is an amazing name for an investor. So that's one thing. But the second thing I'll say is, yeah, how do we? I think. And you actually answered one of the questions that I was going to ask next. Is that's another big idea for small businesses that we can create, right? Like, how do we aggregate the needs and other assets that we need to develop for supporting Black business growth? I think when you look at those VCs who are looking at us and not valuing our markets and the people that are in the Black consumer, they don't value us as a market, but they will in turn take our innovation and our ingenuity and our creativity and then rewrite it, patent it, and then call it something else. Like, you didn't value soul food, but you want to create a whole industry called Southern cuisine, right? And have soul food dishes on that, and then say, no, this is Southern. This isn't soul food. This is Southern. No, it's not. It's soul food, and it's that's what it is, and it comes from this, and that's what. And I think narrative is important too, right? How do we make sure we control the narrative when it comes to things that have been created from the community and that we start seeing in other places? How do we make sure we take that back and then also grow it and protect it, and then be able to create it so that way it's sustainable? That's crucial. So thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go ahead and transition. Go ahead.
Talked a lot before we go in. We've talked a lot about VC capital, and we've talked about debt. I think one other piece, if you think about all capital is not the same, one other piece that's missing is Black angel investors. So people who look like us are more likely to invest in us. Mm-hmm. And we know that on average, it's $25,000 for someone to start their business. Well, we don't, our folks don't have $25,000, right? Like most of our friends and family, we don't have a rich uncle, we don't have a rich auntie. But there are enough of us Black people, who could pool our money and crowdsource it if we're focusing on really thinking about investing in the wealth of our communities, we need more angel investors. So there's a woman named Jill Johnson who's running the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership, and her whole work is around having more angel investors. There's this missing capital for Black businesses to even start, and there's that point in time where you actually can't get access to debt yet. You're not going to be big enough to do VC. You need a different form of capital. And so some of that shifting the narrative too is folks on the other side who aren't starting businesses to really look at their investment opportunities in other Black businesses.
Yeah. Have you either of you ever heard of an entrepreneur by the name of Dawn Dixon with Popcom?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So she grew her entire business just off of crowdfunding. And I think she raised what, $2 million through crowdfunding. She also did some pitch competition. She won. She was a winner of the Meet $1 Million Challenge 2 years ago, I believe. And she's been talking and being very adamant about how crowdfunding is an opportunity for Black businesses to get that investment that's necessary to grow a business. And she just finally released her product this past week, I believe it was. But she's been doing some amazing work with Popcom. It's very innovative, kind of innovating on the vending platform, and how can we use to integrate technology and AI to create a better customer experience for vending machines. And when you look at, trying to look at how can we create things that integrate that technology, but then even after now COVID, how much more valuable could these things be? And even for people that have small businesses that have a hoodie company, right? And if I had a vending machine in a mall, I don't have to pay rent for a space in the mall. I can just pay for this machine and then restock my product there, and I can create a better experience from a retail standpoint. If I have an e-commerce business, I can have a vending machine in a mall. It's a smaller footprint. It's going to be less for me to rent that space, and I'll be able to access the product, or my customer will be able to access the product right away versus me having to ship it out to them. So there's a bunch of different opportunities for that. And I think that, if you look up what Popcom and what Donna's doing, she has a podcast she does, and she's doing some great work there too. So,
Sam, if I may quickly say something, I know we're going to transition to the next part. It won't take long. And talking about the strength-based perspective and looking at our community, right, and looking at the Black community and what they do have, of course, this is an inclusive approach. So we want all folks, not just Black folks, to be involved in helping and to be involved in scaling these ecosystems. So I just want to say that. But also, in talking about our strength-based perspective, Black people are the most philanthropic people in the United States, although on average, we make the least amount of money as a racial group. When you think about the amount of money we give to church and we give to charitable causes that we care about, we're used to giving money. So I think one of the things that entrepreneurs could really think about is, how do you repurpose and use this muscle that Black folk already have? We're used to making sacrifices. A lot of these folks who are giving 10% of their earnings to church aren't necessarily making that much money. So they're sacrificing in order to help others, or they're sacrificing in order to further a particular mission. And so it's important for, I think, entrepreneurs to really try to tap in and be innovative about how to get more funding. So perhaps if you're trying to raise $10,000, you might get $10 from 1,000 people, right? Or you might get $100 from, I didn't do that math in my head yet, but really think, or $100 from 100 people, right? So just really thinking about, there are ways to raise money that doesn't necessarily work in terms of, you might not be ready to start pitching to venture capitalists because they may want you to have some revenue already. So just really be thinking about, and if as an entrepreneur, thinking about, I think we use the word hustle, but that's the word that's innovation. When you think about, to be innovative in raising capital, at least early on, if you're an early stage entrepreneur who's in an industry that might not be, that venture capital may not consider a high growth industry, really think about ways to scale your business through crowdfunding and other methodologies that we historically have used and historically has been effective. You just have to innovate in how you think about it for your business.
I love that. I love that. One of the things that we talked about yesterday in another session, one that we had for Black women as access and opportunities, Black women in business, and they talked about how we as a community oftentimes have a short fuse when it comes to our own businesses, right? and how we can do a better job of extending grace when it comes to when a Black business messes up or has any issues. Oftentimes we may say, oh, this business did this and we're never going to go there again. We're quick to cancel people when they've messed up. But when other businesses have done the same thing, we will be back there the next Sunday, right? So how do we, what are some ways that we can do a better job of just extending grace and then supporting these businesses as they go through those learning lessons and those bumps in the road? Because I feel like if we don't do a better job of doing that, and that goes back to the miseducation of the Negro. There's a whole point in that book where he talks about, and this is back in the early 1900s, talking about that same mentality that's prevalent today, as far as the short fuse and like how we are quick to write off our businesses and supporting them. What are your thoughts on that, and how can we do a better job of that? This is more for Jeff because you brought up the book, so I want to hear your thoughts on that.
I think oftentimes we don't recognize the impact that racism has had on us towards one another. Don't recognize the impact that these biases have had on us, and oftentimes we begin to live out the belief systems that we see. So if you're always seeing yourself as a child, let's just give for quick example. If you're a kid and you're always hearing, this is the smart product, this is the smart product, and I present to you the smart product and then the product that someone says is not smart, or the person someone says is not smart, you're like, who would you want to hang out with? You're probably going to say you want to hang out with the quote unquote smart person, just because that's what you've seen, that's what you've been taught. And I think that's what happens a lot of times with our consumer behavior is we expect quote unquote bad. So when bad happens, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then we say, see, that's why I don't want to shop at whatever X location. Whereas the other place, you expect good. So when bad happens, it's more as though, oh, they made a mistake that one time. It's not a reflection on who they are as a person, but more on a particular situation. And you see the same thing when it comes to venture capital. You tend to invest in people who you trust and who you think is a good investment. Most of the time you throw the metrics out the way, right? For someone who you believe in. And if historically you've grown to believe that this group of people, like for example, if we see what's happening in the country now, this is not about politics of where you stand, a Republican, Democrat, or conservative or liberal. But if you look at where they're specifically saying that voter fraud quote unquote, there's voter fraud. Yep. It's all in the major Black areas, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Detroit. So this belief that Black people are inherently corrupt. So just by watching the news, you're taking in this information that Black people are inherently corrupt, right? Yep. And so this is the system that you grow in, and you see it even more and more today. You have to actually counter that by recognizing that you have to have a mindset from an asset base that I expect good things to happen. And if something bad happens, then also the next step you can do is if you had a bad experience, to actually have a conversation with the owner or with the entrepreneur about your experience from a standpoint of, I would love to continue to support your product. Here are some of these things that I would love to see you improve upon. So it's more of a feedback rather than I had the worst experience. And then now I'm going to not only not use your product, but go on social media and talk bad about it. So now no one else is going to it.
Yeah, it's feedback versus crucifixion, right? Publicly. So Ty, can you, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that's, this is part of why shifting the narrative is baked into the path to 1555, because there's so much of the mindset. And we have to do a lot to reclaim our heritage in many ways. I think that's why entertainment has a huge role to play on this. And you think about The Watchmen, for if anybody likes sci-fi stuff, the Watchmen's backdrop is actually the massacre in Tulsa. Yep. And it goes deep into what would it look like if you had reparations? What would Black folks' lives look like? What did they look like before? They were told they could not do so many things, and yet they built this thriving community that was outperforming their neighbors. And I think we need to kind of reclaim our heritage as the entrepreneurs, as the assets that we are, and entertainment actually can play a big role. You're seeing more things about, Madam C.J. Walker and movies like that are sharing. Actually, it is our history to be innovative. It is our history to be able to make $1 out of 15 cents in a huge way, and in a way that's scalable and hopeful and helpful. And so I think there is that kind of narrative there. And I also think it's incumbent on people like us on this phone to educate people. I wrote an article recently called Buying Black Shouldn't Be So Hard. And it was after Juneteenth. And I broke down every time someone says that you have bad service or whatever. Oh, you know why you did? Because there was this influx of orders after Juneteenth and people were like, oh, everybody's woke and they want to help Black people, right? So all these businesses were getting money and they couldn't fulfill their orders. And I kind of broke down, why can't they fulfill their orders? Well, you actually need to have inventory on hand. And you know what it takes to have inventory on hand? You need to be able to have access to capital. Oh, you know what it takes to have access to capital? You need to be able to have a loan. Or, oh, I want to go to a Black restaurant, but none are nearby. Oh, you want to know why? Because the rent in your neighborhood is at this level and the rent in their neighborhood is at this level. And what it takes for them to get a loan or what it takes for them to, it's like, oh, wow, buying Black is hard. And so much of that is because the system has made it hard for the Black entrepreneur. Like that's before the Black entrepreneur does anything wrong, right? And but you're holding them to a standard that's based on a system that's basically depressing and oppressing their ability to thrive in many ways.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I think that's it all comes back to how can we create a better environment for Black businesses to be successful. And I think 1555 and 2043 are two initiatives that I think will help us get there if implemented, successfully. Tyler, one thing I love about 1555 is the network piece and really trying to connect with other like-minded initiatives that are out there that are doing similar work, because oftentimes, as leaders in this space, we feel like we're seeing people trying to recreate the real every single different area and solve the problem all at the same time. One thing that Tawana always talks about is how oftentimes in this region, it's like the land of 10,000 nonprofits, right? We instead of 10,000 lakes, and everybody's trying to do nonprofits and give out money. And I think that we have, it's good intentions behind it, but how are we actually solving problems? How are we taking this? Where is this money going? And we're putting money at a problem, but is it actually solving that problem? And how can we work together to pool money together and make a larger sustainable impact versus just putting a Band-Aid on something and then it not really going anywhere, right? So I think there's opportunities now. And I think this year has taught us that we have to do something different, right? COVID exposed so many disparities around the country, and then you had George Floyd on top of that, and then everything else, and then this whole election cycle, and there's just really exposed that we have so much more work to do. But what we've been doing to do the work and trying to solve the problems previously have not been working, right? So now, how do we think differently and how do we move things forward? That's where our opportunity is, and I think that the work that you all are doing is going to be really crucial in that. So want to go ahead and allow for the audience to hear some questions that we have, to hear some questions that they've posed to the group in the chat. And I have one right here from an anonymous attendee asking, in a rural community where Black people and Black communities are growing in a predominantly white population, what are some suggestions on a approach to reaching those entrepreneurs? So how do we reach those rural entrepreneurs? Maybe some of those Black entrepreneurs who are farmers or who are doing more agricultural work, which is very important. It's a very big industry in this country. How can we better support them and get them capital that they need in order to survive? They may not have the technology, right? So what do we do about them?
I can take that one. So outside of Path to 1555, one of our clients, and we call our clients our partners because you have to partner in order to solve large scale problems, is the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And so we have an effort called Advance Together that's about driving economic mobility and resilience. And multiple communities that we're working with are actually rural. And so I think when you look at the needs of Black folks in rural communities, there's this interesting piece where there's so much about rural and urban that has similar challenges, but the population is actually often predominantly white and not Black. So when you think about what are the needs of rural communities, they're often having flight. So people are leaving those rural communities and taking their intellectual property to larger cities. You have access with issues with digital inclusion. So lots of times there aren't access to the infrastructure needed to be able to do things at scale and technology. You have issues with health. There's oftentimes where the closest hospital is more than an hour away. And so I think what we've seen to be really helpful is to partner with organizations focused on rural needs. The Federal Reserve Bank, actually, most people don't know, has a community development arm. And Federal Reserve is not a bad place to start because they have a catchment area across states and so can have a really deep presence in specific communities. Also, United Ways often have a catchment area that is, we work with a group called United Ways of Texas for our rural communities. And they're so far and few between that they're covering all rural communities in Texas. And then there are often groups that are rurally based that are focused on one of those issues I said. So healthcare or economic development or digital inclusion. And those are ways to get at the issues confronting Black entrepreneurs. Because the thing that's interesting is in those communities, white folks are actually experiencing very similar things as Black folks as a whole in their region. The thing I will say though is very, very far behind on issues of racial equity, right? So it's hard to lead with race in rural communities. It's really hard to lead with Black folks need this over this group because everyone feels like they're struggling in a different way. And so that's something that working with these partnerships can help navigate some of those true tensions of race in those communities.
And you bring up a really, really interesting point too. Like in a lot of these rural communities, when you think about that from an economic standpoint, a lot of the rural white people are in the same position economically as Black people are from just access and things like that. Yet their interests are politically are completely different, and they go against their own personal interests based off of the notion of race, right? And that's something that's been going on in this country since the very beginning, but that's a whole nother conversation. I just wanted to point that out. Jeff, did you have anything you wanted to touch on the real question or?
Sure. I think a part of the question is, I think, was the anonymous person asking how to approach Black entrepreneurs as they're growing in rural areas. I would say that one of the ways that you can approach Black entrepreneurs is recognizing that there's mistrust because of the history of race that Sam and Ty already mentioned with Black folks in rural areas. So I think a good way to approach is acknowledge the history of understanding that we may not have always been welcoming to you and your ideas. And we are seeking to make a shift, or we're seeking to make a difference. And we'd like to partner with you. That's a great way, I think, to approach it. Because you're acknowledging and helping folks to kind of lower that fear that may exist, because there may be a fear of, okay, why are you trying to reach out to me? But what's your angle? So I think that that's just important as far as it relates to an approach.
That trust gap is huge. There is a study that was done, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, by Connie Evans from AEO, the Tapestry of Black Business, and she talks about the different gaps: the trust gap, the wealth gap, the opportunity gap, and a couple other things. But the trust gap is huge, especially when it comes to number of different institutions and black businesses, and even just looking at just do I even, if somebody approached me to help me, will I even see it as help, or is it a threat, right? So how do we get over that? That's a whole process in itself. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna go to the next question. So the next question, I don't know who asked it, but the question is, do you have ideas for navigating challenges to getting funding to start a business? If you don't own your own home, to use as collateral, have work jobs with low wages, and haven't built a safety net, how can small businesses navigate these pitfalls?
You mind if I take it?
Sure, you can go and I'll go after you.
Sure. I think that if you don't, we talked about underwriting and all the issues that relates to loans. The reality is oftentimes if you don't have collateral and you don't have all these things, your credit score is not a certain high, you may not get those loans from institutions. I think really tapping into crowdfunding in particular ways. And there's this new kind of approach that folks have now as well, which is reaching out to people that's not in their network. So if you are someone who don't want people to know that you're doing that, and you might not want to do that publicly through a crowdfunding source, you can be really effective at getting small amounts of money from a number of people, especially with your idea. Like a lot of times people will invest into your idea and maybe not necessarily you, especially if it's a small amount. I would say that to try to fundraise in that way, especially to start out. And as your business starts and as you begin to kind of go through that journey, then potentially other institutional capital might become available. But that's one of the issues that we have, is if you're coming from the kind of background and you don't have those assets, it's very difficult to get funding.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So my sister is a school teacher, and she started a business on the side. So I think, just to be honest, you'll probably have to do both for a while. And what my sister has been doing is she uses the sales that she makes on she does, cups, t-shirts, mats, like basically a lot of the retail things we've talked about, and they're always really exciting and innovative. I love them. And she, every time she sells something, she uses her sales to reinvest in more infrastructure, right? So I think some of it is the mindset that as you start to sell stuff, the things that you sell have to pay for the things that you need to buy to start. So you probably have, at a minimum, depending on what you're trying to do, 6 months to a year before whatever it is that you're selling is actually going to make a profit, because you need to reinvest in it to be able to make more stuff. The other thing I would say is there's this great book called Fuel, Fuel, like fuel for your car. And it's a financial book focused on low-income people. So many times there's a lot of books around like, oh, you do this with your 401k or whatever, but people who are trying to make $1.15 often don't have the same tools as other folks. And so I love that book because it's very practical on other ways you can bring revenue in. So if I take my sister again, for example, I don't know if it's everywhere, but in Dallas, there are these things called promos, and you can go for a weekend, like if the fair, for instance, was doing something for a weekend, you can go and you can make like $30 an hour, $40 an hour or sometimes $50 an hour, depending on what they're doing, for just the weekend. So she's like all these kind of quick ways to kind of bring in capital that's not having to get a full-time job, but can also help fuel what you're working. That's where that kind of fuel mindset comes from. So you have to kind of hustle and grind for a little bit until you actually have enough inventory and sales history to be able to get access to that capital. And then the last thing I would say is that for folks in that situation, oftentimes what we see is one of the hugest barriers for getting access to loans is keeping your own separate financial books, like not mixing your personal bank account with your business bank account, and just keeping like records. It feels so silly to do when you're like making $10 or $5 or $20, but you need to show that history to the bank. And if it's mixed with your personal funds, you're often not able to get a loan because they can't tell the difference between what's your business revenue versus what your personal revenue is.
Yeah, and oftentimes too, again, because of that trust gap, a lot of people don't start a business account, you know what I'm saying, for a long time. Sometimes, and one of the things that we actually found was a study done in Minnesota a couple of years ago. We realized that majority of the Black businesses weren't even registered as LLCs, and they were just operating, as they started as hobbies, people doing on the side, but then they grew and they weren't. But you go to the state of Minnesota did a report. They had like less than 100 businesses registered as LLCs. They couldn't find where the Black restaurants were because they didn't have the ones that were around, they weren't registered. So it's like but again, that gap, right? How did they know that they had to do that? Did they understand what that process was? Like who had the access to that information? Those are all things that have been rectified to a degree now, right? But there was a lot of work that had to be done to make sure that the relationship between the institutions and the community was built, so that way they can take advantage of those benefits that it means to get registered and things like that too, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and ask. We got a bunch now. Everybody wants to ask questions as we're getting closer to being done. So thank you guys for being engaged finally and asking some more questions. So I got 3 questions in on deck. I'm gonna go ahead and ask one from Reaper asked a question. Can either of you speak on to the efforts underway or being considered to engage our children / young people in framing their creativity and ingenuity as entrepreneurial?
Sure. So I'm actually on a board of an organization called Big Thought, and it is focused on driving creativity with young folks and service of their economic development. So I think one of the things that we have found in that work is that creativity is actually a huge important skill for the future of work. And creativity is something that most entrepreneurs don't think about. People don't think about with young folks how to channel that creativity in service of entrepreneurship. So I'll take my son, for instance. He has started his own hand sanitizer business. And he sells his little bottles of hand sanitizer at school. We worked on the pricing and everything. And so I feel like giving your young people opportunities to start stuff, even if they're not making a lot of money to start, exposing them to well, what would it take to make this idea take off, and how much does it cost, and getting them in that habit would be really helpful. And I think projects, actually, the classrooms, and what we're seeing in Big Thought is having more classrooms that are doing entrepreneurship as part of the way that they do basic things like math. My son's school has a whole unit where they start a business and they have to use the English class and the math class and the science class all together to figure out patents and how would you price it and how would you do your business plan. And I think that's something that we can do more of, even if the school is not providing it yourself. Even if the school is not providing it, how can we as parents or groups provide it for our students and our children?
That's major. That's major. So we have 3 minutes left. So want to make sure we end on time. Again, thank you again for all of your contributions. Thank you so much to the attendees for asking questions. These questions have been great. I'm going to go ahead and ask the last question, and I'm going to have this go to Jeff. And the question is, beyond funding, how can BIPOC entrepreneurs secure mentorship that are critically often critical to building a successful business?
I think one of the things is learning how to, I don't think we need as many mentors. I'll say this, I haven't had many mentors. I'll say one of the things that we need a lot more of is figuring out and looking for reading up on trends and how things are happening. And the reason why I'm saying that is because oftentimes the mentors that we need are actively building right now. So a lot of people who are seeking mentors sometimes are upset at Black folks who don't have the time because they're actively trying to build, right? And we're in that generation where we're getting our first opportunity to build. So it may seem as though the traditional mentoring and having, however many hours that are needed, that person may not have. So one of the ideas that may be helpful is just reaching out to people and asking questions. So rather than looking at one mentor, reaching out to a diverse group of people that kind of fit what you're trying to do and asking them questions. LinkedIn is really good for asking questions, especially if you're not like a sales opportunity. Folks are really good at wanting to respond to you about that. Twitter is also, I just made a Twitter a couple of days ago. And Twitter's, I know, right? I'm super late.
Like 10 years.
I know, right? Exactly. But Twitter is really good as well for asking people questions. And because I think it's really hard to find mentors because so many of our Black folks are in the process of scaling right now. And it's really hard to give back in that way. So I would say follow certain people to see kind of insights on what they're doing. And then for those if you can get a mentor, I would say that to get that, but I haven't been able to find someone that I could say is a mentor in the sense of I spend a lot of time with, but the little bit amount of time that they do give me have been very important. So maybe that's still a mentor, but I would say focus more on the quality of time from a diverse group of people, more so than the quantity of time that'll deep dive, because oftentimes that time is not available from my experience personally.
Okay, thank you so much. Ty, real quick, do you have anything you wanted to add to that, or are you good?
I'm good.
All right. Well, I'm gonna end on time today. Look at that. So again, thank you all so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and the work that you've been doing. The work that you're doing is crucial to us being able to bridge these gaps and to advance these communities forward. And real quick, where can people find you if they want to connect? What's the best way for people to connect with you?
I would say LinkedIn,
All
but
right.
now that I have a Twitter, I just started a couple of days ago. You can add me at 2043 Vision. Definitely will respond to your inbox on Twitter.
All right.
Yep. At Ty Boyea for Twitter, LinkedIn. You can also go to our website.
Wonderful.
I'm way ahead of Jeff with Twitter, though. I've had Twitter forever.
I just been working. I wasn't yet at the place to be public.
Okay, great. Well, you heard it there. They've dropped their handles in the chat too, so definitely copy those down. Again, so up next, we're going to be having, if you want to go to the BIPOC marketplace and find some Black businesses that you can learn about and patronize, definitely check that out on the event page. And then we're going to be transitioning into our keynote next, which is going to be Nicole Hannah-Jones from the 1619 Project, which is we're very excited about. And so yes, thank you again so much for joining us for the 2020 Powering Inclusion Summit here at the Center for Economic Inclusion. My name is Ndely, Director of Employment Inclusivity, and have a great rest of the conference and a great holiday season. Take care.